We're looking at a workbook called Useful Macros, and as its name suggests, there are some macros associated with and stored in this workbook. We can get to them quickly by pressing Alt F11. Every time you press Alt F11, remember, you're either entering the VBA window or returning to Excel. Now, these macros were recorded and stored in this workbook because they were needed for certain worksheets here. But over time, you've come to realize they have wider applicability. You'd like to be able to use these macros in other workbooks as well. If you want a macro to be available all the time, you want it to be stored in what's called Personal Macro Workbook. Well, we don't see that term on the screen anywhere. We need to actually create this. Once you do create a Personal Macro Workbook, it's going to be available anytime in the future when you open Excel on the current computer where you actually create this. Now, as we look at the code here, we don't necessarily have to understand this. To see it a bit better, you can go to the Tools menu here, choose Options, and a bigger font size by way of Editor Format. Instead of font size 10 here, I'm going to use 16. But the main idea here is we've come to recognize that these are valuable. We'd like to have them available at any time. So let's jump back into Excel, Alt F11, and actually create a new macro. Now we can create an empty macro and put it in this Personal Macro Workbook, or we can create a macro that we really need and store it there. Because when you create a macro, you have the option of putting it into Personal Macro Workbook. So let's say that on this formula sheet here, we've recognized that it's really handy if we could quickly highlight all the formula cells. We can do that manually, by the way, by clicking on a single cell, go to Find and Select off to the right on the Home tab, and choose Formulas. And then we've got to apply a color. So that's easily gotten to. One little caveat there. If you start that process with a few cells highlighted, Excel will only highlight formulas within the highlighted range. Now, in a counterintuitive way, if you click on one cell, it'll look throughout the entire worksheet. So we might begin our macro by jumping to at least a specific cell. So let's say we record a macro. Developer tab is certainly one way to do this. We're going to be storing this in the Personal Macro Workbook. Developer, Record Macro. We're going to give this a name, Highlight Formula Cells. Using an underscore to separate the words here, or simply shifting between upper and lower case. Remember, in a macro name, you cannot have spaces. It cannot begin with a number. For the moment, we'll leave off the keystroke shortcut. We don't want to store it in this workbook. We want to store it in Personal Macro Workbook. Now, what if you don't have a Personal Macro Workbook? By indicating that you want to store a macro there, you are, in effect, creating this if it doesn't already exist. If you already have a Personal Macro Workbook, you're simply adding this macro to the other macros that are already there. Let's click OK. Click on a single cell in case the person using this macro later has highlighted multiple cells. Then go to the Home tab, far right button, Find and Select, choose Formulas. They're highlighted. Let's apply a color from the font group on the Home tab. I'm going to use bright orange here. And to bring out the colors more obviously, I'm simply going to click on cell A1. Could have clicked on any cell. We're done recording. We can go back to the Developer tab and stop recording, or in the lower left corner to the right of the word Ready, click the box. There it is. The macro is stopped. Let's press Alt F11, go back to Visual Basic. And now what do we see over in the project window? A new entry, VBA Project Personal.xlsb. That is the name of the file along with its extension. It's a binary file. Let's click the plus just to the left of it. There are modules in it, or at least one, and there is one. Let's double click it. There's the macro that got recorded. We don't have to worry about the details just yet, but there it is. The macro begins by jumping to cell A1. We select just the formula cells. We apply a specific color, then we jump back to A1 just to unselect them. So that's there in Module 1. Now, how about the macros that are in that other workbook called Useful Macros? It was in Module 1 there. I'm going to double click Module 1. Let's copy these and paste them into Personal. And actually, in the long run, what we want to do is cut and paste them because we don't need them in this workbook anymore. So we highlight the data here, and either from the menu, we can choose Edit Cut or Control X, either way. We're removing them from that workbook, and now we're going to double-click Module 1 under Personal, It's right there. Click at the end here, Control V to paste, or certainly Edit Paste, either way. We can move these up and down, put them in different orders, maybe get rid of some of the empty lines or the comment lines. Anything that begins with a single quote, everything to the right of it is a comment. We don't always need those, but sometimes we put them in anyway. And if we wanted to see more, we could get rid of some empty lines. On the other hand, there could be times when you want those empty rows there within the macro to see the code a little bit better. So a little bit of cleanup here, not truly necessary. Here is where we're storing our useful macros. We think these have applicability in a variety of different worksheets. So by storing macros there under personal, we've guaranteed the idea that in the future, whenever we need to get to these macros, they're going to be available. Let's jump back into Excel, Alt F11. Now, whether it's on this worksheet or that worksheet, suppose we're on this worksheet. Now, we could even be in a different workbook. How do we get to these macros? Possibly there's a keystroke shortcut, or we have a button in the Quick Access toolbar, or we can go to the Developer tab, choose the second button from the left, Macros. We might not be seeing any at first, but where are we looking? If it's just this workbook, remember I moved them out of here. They're not in this workbook. Click the drop arrow, choose Personal. And there we see the 4 different macros. So if I want to use the macro here that highlights formula cells, I'll click that button and then Run. And if later I decide to add a keystroke shortcut, I can come back to the Developer tab, go back to that Macros button, come back here to that very macro that I just chose to use, highlight formula cells, choose Options, and then apply a keystroke shortcut here. So maybe I'll use Control-Shift-F and click OK and cancel. Now, manually unhighlighting the colors, just highlight these. Home tab, font color bucket, no fill. Let's try that keystroke shortcut, Control-Shift-F. So macros that are stored in personal are just like all the other macros, except in the future, anytime you open Excel, those macros are available, the ones in Personal Macro Workbook. Now, something to look out for here that could be confusing. Suppose we go to a different worksheet here, or maybe we stay on this one. We go to Developer, and we want to see the code for one of these macros. So second button from the left chooses macros. And by the way, we can get here slightly faster with Alt F8. Suppose we're about to look at this same macro here, the one that highlights formula cells. We say, I'd like to look at that code. Now, earlier we got to the code by pressing Alt F11. However, if you choose Edit here, and the macro happens to be in Personal, you get this message. Cannot edit a macro in a hidden workbook. What's that all about? Unhide the workbook using the unhide command. This is really unnecessary here. I'm going to close this. If you really want to get to that code quickly, press Alt F11. Now, that brought out the idea and the fact, and you're probably wondering, what do you mean a hidden workbook? The Personal Macro Workbook is hidden. Anytime you open Excel, it's open, but it's hidden. Do we have to unhide it? No. And how would we get to the code here? Close the dialog box and press Alt F11. It seems as if they should be telling you that in the dialog box when you try and get to a macro this way. If we had macros in the current worksheet, we could see the code by way of going to Developer and Macro, but if it's Personal, you can't use the Edit button here. Remember, the best way and probably the most frequent way to get to the code is to press Alt F11. You don't always see the macro that you want, but you can certainly, by clicking the various modules that might be present over in the VBA project window, you'll be able to track down the code. So there is that oddity about Personal Macro Workbook where you can't get to the Edit command by way of Developer and Macros as we saw in here. Now, in the next movie, you'll learn more about what happens when you close an Excel workbook and how you manage that Personal Macro Workbook. But let's say if you do a normal exit from Excel, from now on in, this Personal Macro Workbook is going to be available. And over time, you'll change your mind about certain macros. We could also at times do the reverse here. If we wanted to take out some of these macros and put them into another workbook, or copy them and put them into another workbook, we can do that as well too. And one final thing we could do here, although not critical, in Personal Macro Workbook, maybe we'll have a few more macros after a while. For want of a better term, we could refer to these or think of these as utility type macros. So let's change the name of Module 1 so that it's a utility macro. So over in the project window, let's double click Module 1 just to make sure it's selected. Then below this, you'll see a Properties window. If you don't, choose View Properties, make it visible. There it is already. So with Module 1 selected, in the lower Properties window here, let's drag across Module 1 right here and type in Utility Macros or some other name of your preference. No spaces. Press Enter, and now that's the name of the module, and that's the way it's going to stay. And in the next movie, you'll learn how to take precautions about the changes that you make here and what happens when you close Excel.